Here's how to attack your fantasy draft. First off is league settings. You have to know how your league's rosters and settings are going to affect your draft strategy. The ESPN standard is a PPR league with 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 1 tight end, 1 flex, a defense, and a kicker. If your league starts 3 wide receivers, then you should be taking wide receivers slightly higher in the draft. The same applies if you play 2 flex spots, because more often than not, that second flex spot is going to be a wide receiver because of the fantasy depth that the wide receiver position has. If your league is PPR, then slot receivers and receiving running backs are amazing assets because of their consistent target share and their reception totals each week. If it's non-PPR, then players like Tyreek Hill and Nick Chubb are better assets. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about actual draft strategy. Early in my drafts, I'm really only targeting high floors. And by early in the drafts, I mean the first 1 to 3 rounds. Early round assets don't have to increase in value to be a good pick, whereas late round assets do. The only thing you really need out of your early round picks is that they retain value. You're already picking them to be that top tier asset at their position. So there isn't much wiggle room to go even higher. You just want to make sure that they don't fall down. Think about it like this. There's not much of a difference between the fantasy output of the running back 8 and the running back 4. But there is if that running back 8 or 4 drops down to running back 20, running back 15. The only thing you really want in the early rounds of your draft are stability. Barring injury, generally your early round picks aren't the things that determine whether you win your league or not. It's those late round picks that hit and explode onto the fantasy scene that really determine whether you win the league. Along with floors, I tend to favor drafting running backs early because there tend to be a lot more wide receivers with high upside late in the draft, which is a great transition to our next topic. Late in drafts, I'm hunting upside, that risky player with an elite ceiling. There's 2 main reasons I tend to only hunt high ceiling players in later rounds. The first is pretty basic. Just like with the stock market and financial assets, risk is inherently related to return. In order for a larger return, you need to take on greater risk. The same applies with fantasy football. These high ceiling riskier assets are the ones that are going to be potential league winners. They are what can separate your roster from the pack if they hit. The second reason is a little more complex, so I'm going to present you 2 players. The first has a 5% chance of being a wide receiver 1, 10% chance at wide receiver 2, and a 15% chance of being a wide receiver 3, and then a 70% chance of ending up on your waiver wire. The second has a 0% chance of wide receiver 1, 10% at wide receiver 2, 40% chance of being a wide receiver 3, and a 50% chance of just being dropped. So which one of those players would you prefer? I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to mull it over and really consider which asset you think is better. Now, I have no idea what you just said or thought because this is a one-way screen, but player 2 seems like a better asset at first glance. You're giving up a 5% chance at a wide receiver 1 for a 20% better hit rate. Essentially, you're trading that small wide receiver 1 chance for a better chance of that player actually being useful on your roster.
Wrong. You already forgot the first rule.
We're chasing risk in these late round picks. So here's the second reason that we're chasing upside. I don't care if these later round players bust worse than Jamarcus Russell. In fact, it makes my life easier when some of them do, because I need to have space on my roster to pick up a waiver wire player that just showed up out of nowhere. And I'm less likely to pick that player up if I'm drafting player 2. Now let's run through a scenario with 2 players who I'm going to mention again later when I discuss the players I like and dislike in your drafts. Melvin Gordon and Mecole Hardman. Both are late round picks, but Melvin is a capped upside late round asset, whereas Mecole is a high upside late round asset. Think of Mecole as player 1 and Melvin as player 2. And now let's think about if I drafted each. So let's say I draft Melvin Gordon. He averaged 12.6 points per game last season, and let's be generous and say he averages around 10 points per game this season, as he defers more work to Javonte Williams. Now, I can't just drop a player like that, but no one's going to trade for Melvin Gordon unless they want Javonte insurance. He's just eating up a roster spot and doesn't have any league-winning upside unless Javonte gets hurt. Compare that to Mecole Hardman, who we talked about in our wide receivers video. I will know by week 3 the role that Hardman has in his offense. Now, if you're out there fact-checking me like a little nerd, you might be saying, well, Mecole averaged 8.4 points per game last season. What if he only improves slightly and averages 10 points per game like you're expecting from Melvin? First off, go fuck yourself. Second, I'm not saying that that's impossible, just that I expect McColl to explode this year or fizzle out, rather than being a consistent 10 points per game player like Gordon. The other factor here is that 10 points per game at the running back position is not droppable, but it's a lot more droppable at wide receiver. 10 points per game at running back would have made you the running back 27 last year, compared to the wide receiver 36. Now, realistically, you're not just going to drop the wide receiver 36, but the point remains that wide receiver is much more replaceable than running back. So even if I did drop that wide receiver 36 version of McCole Hardman, I would be fine, because the next 10 wide receivers averaged 157.9 points, whereas the next 10 running backs averaged 149.9 points. Remember, it's also a game of numbers. If I draft all upside in my late rounds, it's almost guaranteed that one of those players is going to bust. So even if it's true that McCole only improves slightly, one of my other high upside picks is going to bust, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because I can replace that bust with someone on the waiver wire who is outperforming expectations. Just to prove it to you, I'm going to run through some players who likely weren't drafted in your league because of where they were ranked last season. Zach Ertz, 167 overall. Rashad Penny, 198. Chuba Hubbard, 201. Cordero Patterson, 209. Van Jefferson, 216. Christian Kirk, 226. Elijah Mitchell, 236. Dawson Knox, 249. Hunter Renfrow, 252. Now that last one with Renfrow caught me completely off guard when I was researching for this video. I probably would have bet a decent amount of money that Renfrow was drafted in almost every league last year. But that's recency bias for you. Before last year, Renfrow's best fantasy season to date was only 145.6 fantasy points. There are going to be players like that this season that we just have not been talking about at all, but explode. So when drafting someone like Melvin Gordon, I'm stuck with him. Whereas when I draft McCole and he doesn't hit that upside, he's droppable. So with that tied up, there are going to be players this season that we haven't talked about at all. Players in the 200s of your fantasy draft that a bloodhound on a Allegro couldn't sniff out. So just for shits and giggles, while we're on the topic, I'm going to give you 5 players ranked 200 overall or higher this year that I think have a shot at having a surprise season. Now, I want to stress, don't draft these players unless you're in an extremely deep league. I'm mainly just doing this because I'm bored, and if I'm right about any of them, it'll be a little cool. First two are Dontrell Hillard and Hassan Haskins at 209 and 237 respectively. Next is Wan'Dale Robinson at 218, Albert O at 246, and David Bell at 284. Hopefully one of those hits, or I'm going to look like a real asshole in a year. And let me know if you want to break down in a separate video why I think each of those players have a decent amount of upside this season. So now that we've explained this strategy, let's quickly run through some of the players that fit into these 4 categories of safe floor early, risky floor early, high upside late, and capped upside late. In the safe floor early category, we have Jonathan Taylor, Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, DeAndre Swift, Aaron Jones, and Mark Andrews. Now, generally, all these players are here because of the volume they're likely to receive in their offense. Players like Jonathan Taylor, Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, and Mark Andrews are almost guaranteed to have high workload seasons this year. And then players like DeAndre Swift and Aaron Jones are going to get enough receiving work out of the backfield that you should feel very comfortable with their floor from week to week. Now let's talk about the early players with a risky floor. On this list, I have CMC, Derrick Henry, Deebo Samuel, Devontae Adams, A.J. Brown, Cam Akers, and Nick Chubb. Now with these players, I'm going to give you a little brief description just because I expect a lot more people are going to be pissed that I'm saying a player is bad than a player is good. With CMC, I'm not saying you shouldn't draft him, just that you have to recognize the risk that comes with drafting him. I'll probably own CMC in one of my leagues, but you have to recognize that he's coming off back-to-back injury-riddled seasons. He has the potential to be that CMC that he once was that was averaging 28 points per game in fantasy, but he could very easily burn you again this season. With Derrick Henry, he's coming off that injury, and I'm really starting to think that his massive workload is catching up. Add on top of that, the fact that the Titans O-line just isn't what it once was. I think a good comparison here is Najee Harris. Both are in similar situations with bad O-lines, but huge workloads, both currently and in college. The only difference being that Najee isn't coming off of an injury and is also younger. Next with Deebo Samuel, I'm just worried about all the pass catchers in the 49ers offense, because while I think Trey Lance is going to be good for fantasy, I don't think he's going to translate to fantasy success for his receivers. With Devontae Adams, I mainly just think that he's not going to see the targets that he did in Green Bay. So we really have no idea how those targets in the Raiders offense are going to shake out. And there is some slight risk taking him as early as you're going to be doing in your drafts. With A.J. Brown, we have the combined problems of Devontae Adams and Deebo Samuel. Brown is on a new team and will likely see a lot less targets than he did with the Titans because of the talent that's on the Eagles roster and because he's dealing with a mobile quarterback in Jalen Hurts. Next, with Cam Akers, we have another player like CMC, who, despite his risky floor, is probably going to be a player I end up with on one of my teams because of how high his upside is. He should be locked into a workhorse role in the Rams offense, but to be honest with you, he just did not look good in the playoffs. But if he returns to form, he's going to be a top asset to hold this season. Lastly, with Nick Chubb, it mainly just boils down to the Deshaun Watson situation. If the Browns are rolling out Jacoby Brissett this season, teams are going to be able to stack the box against the Browns, and Chubb won't have much room to go. Out on top of that, the fact that he doesn't get much receiving work in this offense. Now let's talk about those late-round picks with high upside. We have Rashad Bateman, Christian Watson and Allen Lazard, Miles Sanders, Breece Hall, Garrett Wilson, Robert Woods, and McCole Hardman. For example, Miles Sanders had 0 touchdowns last season, and I think we can compare his workload this season to what we saw in Nick Chubb in the past couple seasons. He's going to have no competition on first and second down and a run-heavy offense with a great O-line, the only factor being he's not going to get a lot of passing work. Next, we have Breece Hall. Now, from our first video, we know that volume is extremely important at the running back position, and I think you're getting Breece Hall's high volume at an extreme discount right now. The Jets used a very high pick in this last year's draft to select Breece Hall. They're going to give him work. The last one I'll give you is Robert Woods. Now, personally, I was a huge fan of Treylon Burks both coming into the draft and after it. But at a certain point, we have to start tempering expectations for him this season, especially with all the negative reports that are coming out about him. Whether it's his asthma or the fact that he hasn't been showing up to practice, we should start considering the fact that Robert Woods might be the wide receiver 1 in this offense. Now, granted, the Titans are a run-first team, but there's still going to be enough targets that the wide receiver 1 role in this offense is going to have value. Now, lastly, let's talk about the players that have capped upside late. On this list, we have Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Devin Singletary, any of the Seattle running backs, Ramondre Stevenson. I'd even throw in Damian Harris, Melvin Gordon, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jacoby Myers, and Tyler Boyd. With a player like Clyde Edwards-Helaire, I think we just have to accept that we were wrong. I think everyone and their mother loved Clyde as a rookie, and now we just have to accept that he isn't the prospect that we thought he was. I mean, we're consistently seeing veterans come in and get playing time over him. It's just that simple. For the Seattle running backs, I mean, their O-line is just horrible. They have no QB right now, and there's going to be 3 running backs in the mix for touches. You just can't. You just can't. It's a similar thing with Stevenson and Harris where, I mean, the Patriots are always switching up their running backs from week to week. Ramondre could have a nice 20-point week one week, and then Damian could have a 2-touchdown week the next, but Stevenson isn't going to get work season long to produce consistent value, and Harris is really only tied up to touchdown production, which isn't something I really want on my fantasy team. Now, we talked about Melvin Gordon earlier, but I do want to expand on my viewpoint of him. So I'm not trying to say that Gordon is a bad pick, just that you have to recognize his upside is capped unless Javonte gets hurt. And handcuffs are fine late-round picks. They're very valuable in fantasy when the starter goes down, but where you're selecting Gordon, there's more than just handcuff value baked in. You have to take him at 116 to get Javonte's handcuff, whereas someone like Chuba Hubbard last year was above 200. Recognize how capped the upside is unless he gets hurt and the cost that it's going to take you to draft Gordon. Next, with Amon-Ra St. Brown, his late season surge came at a time when the Lions literally had nobody else to throw to. Hawkinson was out, Swift was out for a large portion of that stretch, and the only other receivers the Lions had were some random bums that they picked up off the street. Next, with Jacoby Myers, he handles a large number of targets, but looking at last season, he only had 3 weeks with over 15 points. He's not a player that's going to win me a league. And lastly, Tyler Boyd. I'm personally a huge fan of Tyler Boyd, both in the actual NFL and in fantasy, but he's capped by the presence of Higgins and Chase and the targets that they're going to take from him. He's crazy consistent in a great late-round pick in a 12-man league where you start 4 or more wide receivers a week, like a 3 wide receiver, 1 flex league. But for the majority of leagues, he just doesn't have the league-winning upside that we're chasing unless Higgins or Chase get hurt. And the one last thing I'm going to mention before we end this video is that you have to recognize when your league is drafting. If you're drafting before the preseason even starts, you need to be taking a lot of late-round running back handcuffs. Like, if you're drafting before the first preseason game, if you're drafting before the Hall of Fame game, Melvin Gordon is a must pick, right? Like, there's so much time in this offseason still for players to get hurt, for players to tear an ACL, tear an Achilles. Like, there's so much that can go wrong that if you're drafting early in the offseason, you need to be taking running back handcuffs. Someone is going to get hurt. We just don't know who. And then, obviously, if you're drafting that Wednesday or Thursday right before the week 1 games start, those handcuffs decrease in value a lot. Like, we know already who's survived through the offseason, so those handcuffs become a lot more just insurance policies rather than hidden upside picks. Either way, that's the video. I really hope you guys enjoyed it, and I appreciate any likes, comments, and subs. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good one.